Welcome to the Knife Show, where we dissect the human psyche and society. Joyce. My name is Denzel. I'm an ENFJ.
And my name is Joyce. I'm an INFJ. Can we restart this? I'm so sorry. I'm laughing because Denzel's so chill right now, and it's so funny. When I just watch people who are so comfortable with just relaxing and sailing, and it just is kind of funny.
Well, thank you, Joyce. I appreciate your presence.
You have that natural zen, and I zen pattern. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Type
I get-
9.
Oh, yeah, it probably is. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm probably just also low-key ESTP, inferior NI.
of course. I'm also ESTP.
And on that note, so today we are actually talking about thinking for yourself and sheep mentality. This isn't something, and I want to emphasize this, this is not something that only NFJs struggle with. However, or FJs in general. However, NFJs and SFJs are the types that have extroverted feeling, or FE, over their introverted thinking, or TI. And so what tends to happen with these types is that they tend to often accept information from other people more readily and more easily, rather than, vetting the information themselves. And we've all kind of like been indoctrinated in our own sense. In fact, there's a quote that Antonia Dodge always says. I specifically asked her, like, hey, what is that quote? And she said, the easiest way to be brainwashed is to be born. Robert Anton Wilson. And that to me is just so true. As soon as you are born, regardless of whatever type that you are getting brainwashed. You are becoming indoctrinated. You're being told that colors exist. You're being told that water is healthy for you. You're being told that you have to suck from your mother's nipple in order to be able to survive. And then soon it's going to transfer to a bottle and all of these different things. And you continue to be told different types of information. You're told that God exists or that God doesn't exist and all of these things. And it's not that being told things necessarily is wrong, but rather that when you're told things and you just readily accept everything without questioning them, that's where sometimes you can get in trouble. However, we're also going to talk about the reverse of that, which I believe that a lot of TPs sometimes, so ISTPs, INTPs, ESTPs, and ENTPs, they could probably struggle with, which is pretty much whatever they are told, they question it. And sometimes you can question things a bit too much, and you'll be that sheep that when you see all of the sheep running away, you sit back. It's like, well, I'm not like the rest of y'all sheep. I don't know what we're running from. And then you get caught by a wolf, because oftentimes sheep mentality can also not, like, sheep mentality, in my opinion, and maybe I'm biased because I'm a TI inferior, is not always a bad thing. If enough people or a lot of people have already noticed the danger or have already like done research in a certain area, then again, it's not bad for you to analyze it yourself, but you can probably still take it and at least just hold it with, a grain of salt kind of thing. But I'm excited to hear what Joyce has to say, because Joyce has FE and TI right above each other. So her TI is just naturally like stronger than mine, but she still leads with FE as her dominant extroverted judging function. So Joyce, all that being said, what is your experience? I love asking you questions to get you to talk about yourself. What is your experience with thinking for yourself and knowing when to accept information readily, if ever, and when to like go with the sheep, when to question things, etc.? And if you had any other comments on anything I just said to add on to it.
Yeah, it's very hard for me sometimes to share my own opinion of things if I know that it's controversial or if it'll offend people.
Mm,
So sometimes it's easier to have a sheep mentality because I just don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. And when you go with everyone's opinion, then you don't have to hurt people, but then it also forfeits you sometimes from thinking for yourself.
mm,
And so sometimes I do have an opinion of my own. I just have difficulty with feeling permission to share it. How I noticed the INFJ's TI be a little different than the ENFJs is that ENFJs will ask way more people about like, hey, what do you think? Hey, what do you think? And get everyone's opinion to get their TI on the subject and
mm.
all of their vetting process, and then apply it to themselves and kind of go like, okay, I'm going to vet everyone's opinion now, and then just kind of triangulate and see how I can create my own TI from this.
Yeah, I'm an ENFJ and I approve of that message.
Yeah, whereas I think INFJs do it more in a solo process. They might do some of that, but INFJs tend to only do that when they start doubting themselves. But if they're quite sure, they won't necessarily go through as much asking other people. Whereas ENFJs just do it on autopilot.
Yeah, that makes sense. And from my perspective, it's definitely that FE being first, TI being last. And so FE is like, okay, let me go and like see what everybody thinks about this kind of thing. And then especially having NI, you want to be able to hop into other people's perspective because NI is able to hold many contradicting perspectives at once. And then TI is able to hold many contradicting thoughts at once. And so now it's like, okay, since TI is inferior, it's more difficult. It's not that we can't do it, of course, but it's definitely more difficult to like chisel away at it like on your own. And so it's probably like just like easier for us to like go and like specifically like ask other people what they think about this, what they think about that. Then you come back and you're looking at everything, and sometimes people will contradict each other, you know? So it's like this person will say this, but then it'll contradict what this other person says. And then when you see that in the real world as an EFJ, then it's like, oh, great. I didn't have to work out that contradiction on my own. They canceled each other out. So now I don't have to listen to any of them, or I know which one to listen to, and I didn't have to do the work. And I can see already like some thinker types probably looking at me saying this is like, oh yeah, and they make us do like all the intellectual labor in that way. But it's not really the case, at least in my opinion, because we do bring back all of those perspectives. At least I know, like for me, and I will sit down. I mean, people see it on my channel, my individual channel, all the time. I will sit down and I will contemplate forever, like, okay, these are all the things these are all the perspectives and thoughts that I've gathered. Which one do I agree with and why? All right, well, John said this. I don't know, because, you know, this kind of contradicts what Matthew said over here. But then, you know, then Luke over here says this. So I don't really know. But then Clarissa, well, I actually like what she said over here because that makes sense. And so it kind of contradicts with what Luke said, but yeah, toss that. And now you're starting to piece things together. And then, to the best of your knowledge, you take that out into the world, and whatever you have currently, then we do the EFJ thing again, where it's like, all right, so this is where I currently stand with ABC. Mm-hmm. And you invite people to come and attack it again because you want that right answer. So the way that I see it a lot of times, and it's difficult, you know, it's difficult because nobody wants to be told like, that's what you think, you're wrong, you know, like whatever. But when you like are constantly like searching for truth, there's no face to lose when you're looking for truth. That's what I believe. And so as long as I always have this mindset of I'm just trying to find the truth, then I think I'm always going to be willing to share whatever my opinion is right now with people. And then if somebody gives me a differing opinion, then I always want to take that into consideration and tell them like, oh, thanks for teaching me something different. Like, you know, I'm going to throw away my old opinion, the old data, and I'm going to replace it with this new one, or I'm going to vet it a little bit more, stuff like that. But yeah, you're totally right. At least from my experience, that EFJs do often like go asking more, a lot more than IFJs do. And I think that the lower FE goes in everybody's stack, then the less they're going to go out to the tribe to like ask, because they rely more on their own opinions. Which yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Denzel. And extroverts in general will prefer talking out things. It's just different extroverts will talk out different things.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so with the FE DOMs, they often try to get social data a lot of the time. I completely relate to your explanation, Denzel. That's exactly what I do. I just do it a little less than you do. And I think that's where the difference is. So another example of NIFE at work is this. So with the Enneagram, there are many contradicting schools within the Enneagram. You have Beatrice Chestnut, who doesn't believe in tri-type and doesn't believe in wings, right? And so she's very staunchly like, don't do wings and don't do tri-types. And then you have the tri-type school, Catherine Favier and David Favier, who created tri-type, and they're like, well, it's useful and I can see its use. And they also vouch for wings as well. And so I can hold these separate opinions and not discount one another. Whereas most people would pick one school or pick the other. I'd be like, in some circumstances, that's more useful. And in some circumstances, that's more useful for different people. Because I want people to be as happy as they can with the tools that we have. I don't want to, like, if tri-type fits someone, then I'm not going to exclude that fits them. It's their experience. Like, well, how can you invalidate that? And so I hold space for that. If it makes sense for you, then it makes sense for you. I don't want to take away the social value of the tool just because people have certain rules over the tool. And if someone doesn't believe in the tri-type, I'm like, yeah, I can see that and that reason for why you don't believe it. That makes sense. And so a lot of people would be like, that's blasphemous. NIFE is blasphemous. It can hold these viewpoints that are completely contradictory and not bat an eyelash. To me, they don't actually seem contradictory, though. You can have these two views existing in one. I just take the value from each approach. So I see the value in this approach, and I see the value in this approach. And so I'll just take whatever value that's there. And if I don't see value yet, then I'll just sit on it and be patient. And maybe one day I'll find value in it. Or maybe I'll never find value in it. But I'm willing to wait and sit there and wait for if I see a different perspective of it one day, then I will incorporate that into my weird worldview. I'm not so open to closing my mind so quickly. And that's why I guess NI is a perceiving function, because it's waiting and it's waiting and it's waiting if any new insight comes in. While most people aren't that patient enough to wait for things to make sense, NI's like, if I wait long enough, things will eventually make sense. And so I'm just waiting for that process of things to load up to 100%. And when it loads up to 100%, I have that insight. And I can share it if I have FE and I want to teach the group about it. Right?
That makes a lot of sense.
With FE users, though, when you have it in the first or second slot, it can really cause you to doubt your own opinion very quickly. Even if you're right, that's the sad thing. If someone says something very confidently, you might actually get kind of influenced because of the FE sheep mentality. For instance, here's an example. I was telling a group of people in the type community about the most common mistypes for the ESTJ. So I think a common mistype for ESTJs that people already know about is ENTJ. Sometimes ESTJs will think they're ENTJs, but something that's not talked about enough in the community is that they also sometimes think they're ENFPs or ENTPs and EDOMs. And that's very often, most of the ESTJs in my life have considered that. And then they realize that they're ESTJ after. And so I said that. And I got pushback from one of the members there. And they're well known in the tech community. So I was like, oh no, what if everything I think is wrong? And so I went through this period where I just took my TI Jenga blocks and I just broke down my Jenga tower. And I'm like, what if only the ESTJs in my life are like that, and outside of my life they actually type as something else? And I literally flipped upside down my worldview in order, like I bent over backwards to see what someone else was seeing, because and I was like, well, if I just wait long enough, maybe it'll all settle and it'll make sense finally. And then eventually what happened is this person came around to seeing exactly what I saw, and they made courses on it too. So they're like paid courses. And it's like, hey, the ESTJ personality type, the most common mistypes are the ENTJ, the ENFP, and the ENTP. ESTJs tend to consider they are those types when they don't think that they're ESTJ. Like, I'm like, gosh darn it, that's exactly what I told you. And you made out my own opinion when eventually you came around to agreeing with what I agreed with. And it drove me mad because I went through this cycle of distrusting everything I thought, because I think FE really values connection and meeting you where you're at. It's like, I want to really meet you where you're at and see what you're seeing. And eventually you realize that they didn't put a lot of thought into what they were seeing. They didn't TI vet what they were saying. They didn't check if it was clean data. They just gave you dirty data. And then now I'm kind of frustrated because I went 90% for you and they didn't even go 10% for me. And that a lot of FJs maybe struggle with them always bending over backwards and people pleasing, but like going miles for other people, while other people won't even scratch their back a little bit. And so, yeah, that's my experience with doubting myself, because I really want to place weight on people's opinions. And so I sometimes gaslight myself and I doubt myself in order to make sure they feel like their voice is heard, which is so counterproductive to myself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally get that. Like, and unfortunately, this isn't to call these types out, but it's just from my experience, what I've seen. That happens a lot, usually with those who have the TEFI polarity in their stacking. And then on top of that, if they have NESI in their stacking, so like the NFPs and the STJs mostly, and then NTJs, SFPs a lot of times too, because they have a tendency, not all of them, there are some that don't do this. So I want to say this before somebody's like, well, I'm not like that. Get that. But like generally speaking, there is a trend and a pattern that if you have TE in your stacking, you say things as if it's an objective and empirical fact before you've even vetted it out. And because, at least as an FJ type, I'm so low-key like insecure about sharing false information, because if you share false information, not only are you spreading false information that's going to go around the whole community and influence the community in that negative sense, or potentially negative, because no, I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole. Anyway, but yeah, on top of that, now you are bringing like shame and discredit to yourself as well, because people are gonna, like, if they find out that the information that you spread was wrong, then it's like, yo, dude, did you not look this up? Did you not like vet this? Like, and especially if you are a leader in the community, if you're like a thought leader, or if you have influence in some way, you have a responsibility to vet that information that you're sharing properly. And so when you have this kind of influence, then you want to make sure that you're wielding that influence appropriately. And it's hard to like wield it appropriately if you are just taking the information that people like give you and then just running with it. So like this could even come down to things such as, like, for example, in our profiler training class at Personality Hacker, and I hope that she doesn't come for me for stating this, but I always see online that Jennifer Lawrence is typed ENFJ or even ENF or ESTP and stuff like that. And I'm just always looking like, okay, sure, maybe, I don't know. But in our Personality Hacker profiler training class, I remember one time where we were looking at We were looking at shoot, what's that ESFJ person's name? I forgot. She's like friends with Jennifer Lawrence. She's white. I think that she was in the Spider-Man movie. Can't remember, but yeah, I can't remember. Anyway, she like we were looking at her and her interview with Jennifer Lawrence and Antonia Dodge. Again, we weren't even looking at Jennifer Lawrence, but Antonia Dodge had just said like, and by the way, like Jennifer Lawrence is an obvious like ENFP, which is very, very rare for Antonia to like say something like that, like obvious. But because she is, and from what I've experienced, such a really good profiler, she really vets her information, all of that, then I definitely took that and I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah, then I believe that Jennifer Lawrence is the ENFP. Nobody else can tell me otherwise, kind of thing, you know? Whereas, like, you know, a more healthy approach would be, well, let me say the opposite extreme. So that's the FE Dom, I guess, way. Like, oh, yeah, I guess that's just it. Case closed. The TI Dom thing could be like, I don't know. Let me like that might be false or whatever, and just like reject it right away, potentially. But I think that when you have it balanced, when you have the FE and the TI integrated, then
Yeah.
you do a good job of being like, oh, this credible person has said this. Okay, that might be likely, but let me make sure that I do the research for myself as well to see if this can match up, which I did end up doing later on. And I'm like, yeah, I actually do agree. I believe that Jennifer Lawrence is an ENFP as well.
Yeah. I
And
think
yeah, and so stuff like that, it helps because then it's like sometimes people will give you information that is true, you know, and you don't necessarily have to question it, but it's very helpful to get into that habit of questioning it. But at the same time, make sure that you don't question it too much. Because again, if we're speaking like literally, when a whole flock of sheep start moving in one direction, then there's most likely trouble. And if you're someone who's like, I'm not a sheep, I don't have the sheep mentality kind of thing, again, you're gonna probably get caught by a predator. So there's good times when to just follow the sheep almost without question, or just question it later. Hold it, you know, with an arm's length. And then there's bad times where it's like you just follow the sheep, and then next thing you know, you see they're all jumping off a cliff for whatever reason. Probably not the best time to just follow them. Who knows, you know? And so, but yeah, back to the whole TEFI thing. I've realized that like a lot of TEFI users, they state things as like all the time, almost as if like it's just obvious and empirical. And when you are an FE user, FETI, but especially like FE higher, it's harder to state such things as if they're obvious because you're so aware of like things that could be contradicting, and on top of that, you want to make sure that you're leaving room for somebody to be able to combat that opinion in case it might be wrong. But if you state something just like that, it's almost as if it's like a case closed kind of thing, which I actually learned from an INTJ and a few other TE users, that even though they might speak like that, they're not actually always as confident about their answer as they really are. Sometimes they are though. But yes, like other times, something like other times they're just stating it and they're still expecting you to combat them with like, that's not true. Whereas like an FE user, they will state something like, yeah, this is what I think, you know, and they'll like share it even though they're really confident in the answer, but they're still leaving room for you to be like, oh, actually, Joyce, I don't really agree with that, because they want you like, you know, to feel free to disagree and educate them on the right answer. Whereas like with TE users, TEFI, in my experience, they claim that they are still open to the right answer, but they just might not sound as inviting or as insecure and unsure of whatever they're saying. So that tone difference, which again, I revert back to FE on that. Like FE is so aware of the nuances of how to say something and the tone in which you say things. Whereas like TE might not be as aware of it. So they're not even knowing that by stating this, they're like, huh, I wonder why nobody ever really challenges the things that I put out there. And it's like, well, that's because every time you put things out there, we don't know if we're invited to challenge it. And like, or because if you've already made up your mind on something and you state it as if, you know, I'm interpreting it as if you've already made up your mind, I'm not going to waste my time trying to influence your opinion. But if you state something and you seem like you're leaving room for people to disagree and, you know, whatever, and you're going to be open to changing your mind to receiving like different perspective and stuff like that, then yeah, I'll definitely go at it with you. So that was something that I definitely had to like learn, that TE users, they might speak that way, but it's not always the case. Although sometimes it is the case, which is, you know, just a quick story, like ESFP that I know that I used to work with. I served this astronaut guy who used to be an NFL player, Leland Melvin. And pretty much that started a whole conversation between me and the servers about like, you know, the moon. And the ESFP girl said so confidently, she was like, yeah, you know, it takes like 3 years to get to the moon or something like that. And me and the other, like two of the other servers were like, I don't think that that's right. And she confidently asserted, like, yeah, no, like, oh, now we're swearing now. Like, yeah, I swear. It's like, no, it's just like, so somebody did look it up on Google and showed her, and it said something like actually like 2 to 3 days or something like that. And I made a joke. I was like, oh, yeah, you were close, but like, it's just crazy because some people really will state something so certain. Oh yeah, of course, like, you know, that's the case, and it's like they haven't even really vetted out the information. So you got to be careful. You really got to be careful about that.
Yeah, and statistics don't speak for the individual, so you can still be an FI user who doesn't hold their opinion that strongly too. So there are different variables that go into it, but generally on a whole, FITE tends to be more confident than TIFE when stating its opinion. I even coined a term after it. It's called the FITE 180. So they'll one day be very confident about one opinion. They'll say it with such passion and conviction and 100% surety. And the next week you talk to them, they're actually on the completely different side. They're just as passionate and they're like, yeah, you know what? The other side sucks. They're right about this conviction. And then it blows my mind because I'm like, you believed in the other opinion just as strongly last week. How do you know you're not just as wrong right now?
Especially when you throw NE into the mix, then that just amplifies it even more. And it's like, whoa, like you never know when they're going to switch to a different thing. I literally have a video of an ENFP, and it's a really, really old video. But like in the video, it was like, it's called like 7 minutes with my friends or something. This was years ago. But pretty much this ENFP guy, I was recording him right after we watched Beyonce's visual for Lemonade. And I was like, hey, Kendall, so what did you think about Lemonade? And he was like, oh my gosh, it was so awesome. Beyonce is a legend. She's beautiful. This is that. Boom. And he was like emphasizing it. Literally, I put like a little time lapse. So like about 2 minutes later, I was like, hey Kendall, so what you think about Lemonade? I swear to you, it's on video. And he's like, I mean, I think it was okay. You know, like, you know, it was all right. She could have done better over here, and boom, boom, and boom, boom. And I was like, oh, you know, he's like, yeah, you know, she's not really like this, but whatever. And I was like, okay, interesting. So you don't think what you just said a few minutes ago? And he's like, wait, what did I just say a few minutes ago? Are you recording this? Like, but then by the end of the video, he had went right back to me like, oh my gosh, like she's a beautiful legend, like I'll die at her feet. And I was like, and so yeah, it's like, you know, even for something as small as that, yeah, exactly. And again, not all ENFPs are this way, but it's just one example that, like, to me, it's like that's how quickly people can really like change with, like, they can say things so passionately, and you might be like, okay, like, because if I say something that passionately, I'm most likely not going to change my mind on it.
Yeah.
Or at least anytime soon.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, it's easy for them to change their mind, even though they sound like they're not going to.
Yeah. With FJs, they kind of want to see your preferences and what you value so they can best accommodate that as they can. But if you keep changing it, then it gets confusing. So it's like, wait, you like Beyonce now, you're very neutral or you hate her. Wait, I need to know your preferences so I can best please you. But then now you keep changing them, and my FB is so confused as to how to make you happy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I go through that confusion. It's even like with my ENFP friend, I was trying to make a logo for my website. And so I showed her the first logo, and she's like, this logo is horrible. Never use that. And then I got a few more logos. And then she's like, you know what? These aren't that good. Can you show me the first one? And then I showed her the first one again. She's like, you know what? This one is good. And I'm like, you just told me it was bad.
Oh man, yeah, it's really funny how that works. And so, yeah, bringing it right back to like, the sheep mentality thing. I think also like I'm grateful for, and I think that's how we're going to wrap it up, like knowing when is it a good time to trust your own thinking and when is it a good time to trust, the sheep mentality. So like, I know for me, one personal example is that, again, back to that whole quote, which, by the way, there is another quote that I wanted to share that, let me see if I have it here. Oh, yes. It's by Richard Dawkins. He says, "Do not indoctrinate your children. Teach them how to think for themselves, how to evaluate evidence, and how to disagree with you." And I absolutely love that quote because to this day, again, from the moment that you're born, you start getting brainwashed. And I personally don't think that brainwashing is always bad. If you've been brainwashed to believe that sticking a fork into the outlet is not a good idea, it might be something that you should trust the sheep mentality with and just, you probably won't really live to actually try that out and be like, oh yeah, I should have trusted them. So there's certain things that it's probably best to take it from the herd of sheep. But then there are certain things that, you need to question. And again, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's wrong. It just means that, like, if anything, when you vet it yourself, now you can be more confident. So one personal example is everybody who follows me on my YouTube channel, they all know that I identify personally as a Christian. I prefer personally, for my own reasons, a Jesus follower, because I think that Christian has like so many connotations to it now, especially like throughout history in the past and everything. So I'm just like, look, I just follow what Jesus said and taught. And I love the man. I believe that, yeah. So all that to say though, like growing up, I did grow up in a Christian household. And now I'm at a point where it's not that I'm rejecting my faith and throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but I have learned that a lot of things that I thought were just the inherent thing for Christianity were just actually mainly from the church. The church has its own rules that they founded from the Bible, but then they like added some more stuff to it. But then they made it seem like Jesus had said it, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And unless if I had not gone back myself to learn about how to properly read the Bible and context and looking at historical data and all of these other things, then I would just take whatever the sheep mentality of the church is and run with that. And so now I'm in this process where I'm like reconstructing my faith and, deconstructing and then reconstructing it, this whole Jenga framework of how I view spirituality, Christianity itself, the history behind making the Bible, like all of that. I'm just making sure that everything is airtight, so that, now when I move forward, it's not going to be just, oh yeah, I grew up in this Christian household and I just took everything they taught me. But now it's like, I think that stuff like that is actually helpful with Uh, it's helpful in the sense that they've given you a framework to work with. So now that your family has given you this framework, it's up to you to grow up and look at the framework like, okay, this framework has brought me this far. How much of this framework is no longer serving me? I'm still going to keep this. Okay, I'm still going to keep that. And I looked into this and I think I don't want that, but I looked into this and I'm going to keep that. And now you get to make the framework yourself. And then maybe when you have your own kids and stuff, now you kind of like pass that down to them. And then because you need some type of framework to go through the world, you know. But as you're working with that framework, as you go through the world, then you have to, like, as you're growing, you're going to be also shedding some of those things. And you're going to be picking up new things. And I think that it's important to know how to reconstruct and to deconstruct comfortably. It's not always having to be something that you'll lose face with. But sometimes it's hard because a lot of people will put their identity into a lot of these thoughts and even maybe their reputation in certain areas, you know. But once you make yourself available and open to being wrong, and like, I think that people actually respect you a lot more because they'll trust you a lot more because they're like, hey, Denzel's someone who is, when he sees that he's wrong in a situation, he's not gonna flare up. He's going to be like, oh no, actually, thanks. Like, I honestly did not know that. I own up to it. And yeah, you're right. I did mistype that person. Or yeah, you're right. I didn't know about this historical fact about the Bible or whatever. Or thanks for enlightening me though. And once you can see that somebody's open to receiving truth, and they're not going to like battle against it when their truth has been proven wrong, then you can trust them with the things that they do share a little bit more readily. So that is something that, you know, I've been continuing to work on. And I think that that's, in my opinion, good integration of FETI, being able to go out, because you never want to be on the extreme where you're just taking everything of what the sheep are saying and doing without questioning it. But again, you don't also want to be on the extreme where it's like you're not listening to any of the sheep. Like, like my ISTP brother-in-law, when he taught me about Myers-Briggs for the first time, there was a lot of people that he had typed, and he typed a lot of people correctly. He typed me correctly, you know, as an ENFJ, and he typed Jamila correctly as an ISFP, but their mother, he typed her as an ENTJ. And so my view of ENTJs was a very, and this isn't like call out, like, you know, Jamila's mother or anything, like, was just different, when in actuality, when I got to know her and I learned more about type and I went to profile training and all of this, and then I talked to her more, I was like, oh, she's actually an ISTJ and she's a sexual one. So that colors, you can imagine how that's like, you know. But I remember, like, you know, Jamila's older brother, like when we first got into type, he was my main teacher. And I was like asking him questions like, so people online are saying that the Joker is ENTP though. And he's like, don't listen to people on the internet. Listen to your big brother. And he's like, I'm telling you, he's ESFP. And I get his logic now. And now he's a lot more open, especially it's like stuff that, because he knows, like, yeah, Denzel's definitely dove way past all of this. So we go and revisit things, and I'm like, yeah, so remember how we were watching like Parks and Rec, and you said that you think that Leslie Knope is an ENFP? I actually believe that she's an ESFJ, not ENFP. And that makes sense because this, that. And remember how you told me that Ron Swanson's an INTJ? I'm actually now thinking that he's ISTP. But you were right that this person's actually this, and boom, 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 and then this is why. And now that has like helped both of us to refine, you know, our view of type. He's no longer in the don't listen to anybody on the internet kind of thing. But I also don't just go and take what everybody on the internet says. Like, we both had to learn for ourselves, and then we have to share our perspectives with people online. and see how that plays out in real life. And so I feel like that's, and it's cool because he's the reverse type of me as an ISTP. So I think that's, in my opinion, a very healthy way of integrating that FETI, being able to follow the sheep and like know when to follow the sheep versus also having your own thoughts as a rooted grounding, but not getting too sucked into that as well. That's my spiel.
Yeah, great spiel, Denzel. What I got out of that was trust the subject matter expert. Before, the bigger expert was Jamila's big brother, and now it's you because you've studied this way more. And so the expert role has changed from him being more acquainted with the theory to you being more acquainted to the theory. Right. So when you know you're more of an expert than someone else in a field, it's more likely that you're right just by knowing more about that type and getting trained properly. And so that factors in because there's a lot of Dunning-Kruger, right? He was very confident when typing someone as an ENTJ. And it's kind of like people overestimating their skill level. And so Dunning-Kruger is when someone thinks they're an expert when they're really a novice. And so a lot of people can feel very convicted with the wrong beliefs sometimes. And sometimes following the herd is better because the herd might know things that you don't know yet. And you just have to wait a while for it to make sense. And you're like, oh, now it all clicks, It's kind of like, let's say you're on a camping trip, right? And on this camping trip, they say, don't go down that trail. And then you're like, well, why are we being sheep and we're just listening to them to not go down that trail? I'm going to go down that trail. So while no one's looking, you go down that trail and then you get beaten to death by bears and coyotes because the people who own that place know that there are coyotes in that area and they specifically tell you not to go because you will die. So sometimes there's insider's knowledge. There's reasons for why there are certain things in place, and overly trying to rebel and overly trying to question everything will actually be in your detriment because it's almost like they did all the hard work for you and they're just expecting you to kind of not make it difficult on them. So those are situations where it's good to follow the sheep and good to follow the herd. It's also good as a starting place. So, Denzel learned a lot about type from the guy who got him into type. And there are a lot of people he did type correctly. So sheep mentality is good as a starting base. It's good for a foundation. And then you can then pick apart it. You go like, this part I agree with, this part I don't agree with. But it's good as a gist. And then you can refine the gist with your own shebang and make it more accurate over time. But I feel like the crowd mentality is a good place to start sometimes because then there might be a reason for why they believe the way they believe.
Yes.
If we go back to caveman times and you see the rest of the cavemen not eating the colorful frogs and you're like, okay, you know what? Because they're avoiding the colorful frogs, I will also avoid the colorful frogs. And so sheep mentality is helpful there because it's most likely poisonous. And the reason why they're avoiding it is because it's poisonous. But sometimes it's hard to communicate that knowledge to someone else that that it's poisonous because then you'll have to explain why it's poisonous. And then you have to explain the origins and then that's wasting too much time for some people. And if you do with every single thing. And so sheep mentality is good for cavemen reasons as well. Yeah, another different point I'd like to make too is Denzel, you were talking about TI users, about how they're more likely to think for themselves in situations. What this causes is for them to go against the tribe sometimes. I've had a few TP anti-vaxxers tell me about their stance, very in depth too. And I was like, interesting. And I'm saying not all TPs. Like there's some that are like,
I always have to make that disclaimer, right?
yeah. We're not saying all, but what it exemplifies is that sometimes TPs really like to think for themselves.
Right.
And so if they're like everyone's accepting at face value vaccines, I don't care who thinks what. I'm going to see the reasons for myself, and I'm going to vet the reasons for myself. And so it's interesting how there's that discrepancy between the TI leads and the FJs who are like, my friend typed this person as this. Maybe I'll just accept that because they thought through it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because if I typed someone as this, I thought through it very in depth, which someone else might have not,
Yeah,
or
we're
maybe they
projecting.
did, but they went a long way in the wrong way. So you never know. It's not a bad thing or an insult to double check someone's math.
Yeah, yeah. We're projecting our way of being onto another person. So FJs are like, I always do TI in private. I always vet out things on my own, and I think to myself about things. And people don't see how much I've clean sliced all of my thoughts
Oh,
to the nth degree. I've made it as airtight as I possibly can, but I just haven't told anyone. And so when we say something with confidence, we expect that same process. So we're like, oh, you airtight checked it as well. I just don't know your specific process with it, because TI is so individualistic that they have their own way of vetting it too, right? And so you kind of respect that. And so you kind of assume that people have done the TI work when sometimes they haven't, and they're just confident because they're confident.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So sometimes sheep mentality is bad when you're listening to the most confident voice in the room, but the most confident voice in the room is wrong. For instance, there's a leadership exercise where you get broken off into teams, and then people will critique your leadership skills in that, right? And so in one of the teams in this exercise, the critique they got was, all you did was listen to the loudest voice in the group. Like, they just spoke the loudest and they talked the loudest and they were the most confident, so everyone trusted them. And then the facilitator of the workshop pulled up the quiet person's answers to all the questions, and they were all the right ones, like all the right answers. And they're like, if you just listened to that member who was a little more shy, you would have gotten all of the questions right. Instead, you listened to that very confident one that was wrong. Yeah, and so sometimes it's bad to have sheep mentality if it means listening to the most confident voice in the room, because they could be very confident and misinformed. So confidence does not equal expertise in an area but our brains are kind of primally wired to place more weight on confident people, which is good in some situations, bad in other situations. Where sheep mentality is bad is that sometimes you accept things too much just from people's mouth. Like, for instance, like with my ENFP best friend, she was the one who taught me type, right? And so she typed everyone around us, and she did type most people correctly. But now that I've gotten better at type, I've realized that I can't rely on her views anymore. And it kind of hurts to some extent too, because it's like, it feels like you're on a lone journey now. It's like, I have one less person I can trust with vetting type. But it's also this realization, I can't do this sheep mentality thing of asking people for their opinion as much anymore, because now I'm becoming the expert and I have to rely on my own TI. And so there's pressure because, like you said earlier, Denzel, FJs have the tendency to be insecure about their TI, doubt it, and be unsure. And so now there's this responsibility almost. And it's like, oh no, I can't use sheep mentality anymore. Sometimes sheep mentality is not good because it causes things like spaceships to break apart when they're launching. There's this really famous spaceship launch where they forgot to put in the O-ring, and a lot of people knew actually the O-ring was not in. And so a lot of people could have prevented it. It's just that they didn't want to speak up because of groupthink. So sheep mentality is bad because sometimes it creates groupthink. And so you'll have all these people kind of coming to consensus just because they're being yes men to each other. They're like saying yes to every other thought that, the main person is saying. It all comes from worshiping a person. So I think sheep mentality is bad when it becomes a person worship. You're worshiping the opinion of another person when they're human and they're flawed, right? And so that rocket ship could have not killed those people in the ship if someone just spoke up. There were so many people who saw that the emperor wasn't wearing clothes. Like a lot of people, but no one said anything because they were scared or afraid or of something, of either authority of going against the higher commands, or they weren't sure.
Yeah, I think he's not wearing clothes, but nobody else seems alarmed, so I guess maybe he is. It's like, no, clearly he's not wearing clothes. That definitely sounds about right.
Yeah, and that's great when the TI DOMs come in and they're like, Yeah, the emperor is not wearing clothes, guys. Can you
Yeah.
see this? The emperor is not wearing clothes.
Mm-hmm,
So yeah,
mm-hmm.
TI has an interesting stance on both scenarios. They can either deeply go against sheep mentality in a good way or deeply
Mm-hmm.
go against sheep mentality in a bad way.
Yeah. So that's why it's really good to like integrate the TI with the FE. And again, if this is not even in your stacking, the whole point is just make sure that you vet your own information. You don't just take everybody else's information like with, like just right away. But at the same time, try to know when it's okay to take on everybody's information and see it as a genesis, as a framework that you can now like, okay, now I have something to work with, to take apart, to rebuild, etc., etc., etc. It's a little bit of a head start in some situations, and always be inviting for people to come and pick apart your logic, because that's how you're going to improve the logic that you already have. And once you have more of those invitations and all of that, then again, like your credibility becomes better, your security with your own way of thinking, and even with maybe some of other people's way of thinking also becomes better. And then yeah, before you know it, you are sharing good information, clean data, and again, you're always like updating the information that you have, and people again are trusting the information that you have. Uh, so yeah.
Yeah. And so the end takeaway I would like to give you guys is the tip to think for yourself is to take other people's opinions as a starting point, just as a starting point for your journey. And
Mm-hmm.
I would say that for everything, figuring out your Myers-Briggs type, figuring out your emotional intelligence score, figuring out how you want to grow, figuring out the advice you want to take in life. You can ask people, but all it is to you is a starting point. And you are the person who should do the vetting. Everything is material for you to mold. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's all good material.
Yeah.
Everyone's opinion is useful and valuable as long as it's used in moderation and you're not just solely relying on it. If you're
Mm-hmm.
taking other people's opinions too far and blindly trusting it, that's when it becomes a problem. So it's not other people's opinions that are the problem. It's that if you go too deeply into sheep mentality, it's a problem. So
Mm-hmm.
it's good in moderation, but it's not good in excess, which is a philosophy you can apply for a lot of things. And so thank you everyone for watching, and until next time, stay sharp.
また